Hello, everybody. It's good to see a lot of friendly faces on the Zoom. For those of you that I have not met, thank you for the intro, Kelly. I'm John Seckel. I am CAI's CFO here at the National Headquarters Office. I started with the group back in September, so it's almost been a full year for me now. I've almost seen the full financial cycle here at HQ. The one thing I haven't done yet is our audit. So I'm really excited to get into that. I'm sure you haven't heard someone be excited about an audit before. But anyway, let's jump into the presentation. I know we only have half an hour, and I do want to make sure we have some time for Q&A at the end. So I will share my screen here and make sure this all works. I'm just trying to make sure. You guys all see that okay? Did that come
We
through?
can. Yep.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, so today we're going to talk about budgeting. Um, Everyone's favorite topic this time of year. I see Mike out in the audience as well. I'm thrilled that Mike joined again. I have had a similar conversation with Mike somewhat recently, and the fact that Mike keeps coming back for more tells me that we're on to something here, and that that's a positive. So we're excited to jump in. Today, I've got this in the focus session. It's not going to be based on technical accounting. We can get into your technical accounting questions if you have them. Today is more around a practical approach to budgeting that's going to result in a really positive tool that you'll be able to utilize not just during budget season, but throughout the year as you're um, working to review your financials and really make sound business decisions. So let's jump in here. So, I hate presentations that start with a definition, but I thought it was important in this case to align on what a budget is and what it's not, because I've had so many conversations with folks where I just don't know that they fully grasp how valuable a budget can really be. So, first and foremost, the budget is a planning tool. Um, it's not a financial statement. It's used within a financial statement, right, as a mile marker or a point of comparison. Um, but it's not something that gets included in the audit. It's not a guarantee of results. It is in a lot of ways our best guess of where the organization is going to land in the next year. The other piece of this is that it becomes our measure of success within the organization. So in a lot of ways, you folks that are actually setting this budget and generating these assumptions, you're setting yourself up for success or failure in some ways, right? Based on how much work goes into those assumptions and where that budget ends up landing. Um, so, again, it's not meant to predict the future, but it is meant to give you a really good and thorough starting point as you're really planning and trying to manage the year financially. Okay, the budgeting mindset. I see Joyce as well here in the crowd, which is good to see you, Joyce. Joyce will remember some of these phrases as I worked through a similar presentation with the CAI board of directors. Um, what was that back in April? We did a budgeting workshop. And we started the conversation by just trying to level set in terms of how to think about approaching the two sides of the ledger, right? You've got your revenues, you've got your expenses. To me, I like to start on the revenue side, and I want to be conservative. It doesn't mean that I want to sandbag it. It doesn't mean that I want to be overly optimistic. I want to be conservative. I want my assumptions to be grounded in reality, right? I want data points that point to trends that I can then use to actually project out revenue. A lot of our revenue sources lend themselves really well to this concept. Talking about membership dues, you're talking about event registrations, sponsorship revenues, those things. A lot of us have great data points that we can look at to project out. I've found that those data points become really essential to really grounding conservative revenue estimates. So start on the revenue side, start conservatively. Next, we want to move into the expense side. I generally want to be almost aggressive on the expense side. I want to be cautious to some extent. I'd rather overestimate expenses than underestimate, right? So to me, I put realistic on here because that's a softer word. But I actually like being aggressive when thinking about our expenses. I want to maximize our member dollars towards the mission that we're driving, towards our major programs, towards those strategic initiatives that the board wants us to hit on, and really maximize all of that potential value that we've got. So ideally, you've got conservative revenues, you've got a realistic or aggressive expense projection, and then you land somewhere around a balanced budget, right? It doesn't need to be exactly balanced. I think people get hung up on that net impact at the end of their budget cycle, and they want that to say zero at the end, and they want it to be even and balanced and all of that. And that's great, and we should strive to get to somewhere that is close to balance. Um, I wouldn't start there though. To me, when you start building the budget, you shouldn't look at the net position at all. I want to start with the revenue assumptions, start with the expense assumptions, make sure those are grounded before you start looking at where that end result's going to get. Right? We'll get to the end result, and we will certainly look at that and review it before it gets presented and finalized and anything like that. But to me, too much weight, especially early on in the budget process, is put on that net income, net result line item. So, one of the real pitfalls to avoid, and we'll get into some more of those as we go through the presentation, but one of the biggest ones here is assuming a best case revenue and a best case expense assumption at the same time. Like I mentioned, in the first slide, you're setting the mile marker for success here. If you set yourself up with best case revenue, best case expenses because it looks really good in a budget, or you need those figures to balance for some reason, you're really setting yourself up for failure, right? When we get into it, inevitably something's going to go wrong one way or the other. And even if you hit those numbers, now that's the expectation. Great, you hit budget, you didn't exceed it, you hit it, and that's good too. But yeah, I think you want to be careful with how you position some of these assumptions as you work through the budget process. So we've set the mindset now, we've defined a budget. Where do we start? Where do we start the process? To me, the easiest place to start is with a forecast. I want to know where we're going to land in the current year before I actually start planning for next year. So easiest way to do that in most organizations, I think most chapters here, I'm scanning this quickly, most of you are on a calendar year, which means hopefully you've seen June financial data at this point. If you haven't, maybe that's a different problem or a different conversation with your bookkeepers or with whoever's managing your finances. Hopefully you have June data though, so that gives you 6 months of actual data. Ideally, I would take that 6 months of data. I would add in the second half of the budget for last year. That assumes that you actually have a budget that was broken out monthly, but let's assume that you do. You combine those two things. Now you've got your starting point right there. You've got your forecast where you're going to land. I would go a step further. I would review, especially review the budget that you're layering in. Make sure that it still makes sense in terms of how you're recording your revenues, how you're recognizing your expenses. Did some of those assumptions fall from a timing perspective into the first half, right? And we need to actually adjust the budget in the second half to make sure we're not duplicating revenues, we're not missing expenses. I think that's a good process to go through, and that also continues to just get you in the right mindset for thinking about how to plan for the year ahead. But once you've gone through those three simple steps, right? Grab your actuals for 6 months, layer in your budget for 6, do a timing and reasonableness review. You've actually got a pretty good forecast now that you should be somewhat you should be somewhat confident in. In a lot of ways, I can tell you from a national perspective, we get 6 months into the year and we're able to really forecast with a lot of confidence because of how we're recognizing revenues. I know not everybody on this call does that the same way. But you get 6 months in and you do have a lot of the information that you're going to need to really come up with a pretty good landing spot. So that's where I would start, as we start to think about actually building that foundation for the budget. Get yourself a good forecast. So once you actually have that forecast and you start translating that then into, okay, well, what does that then look like for a budget? One of the questions that I would really challenge each of you to ask yourselves is, am I being consistent? Are we being consistent, I should say, as an organization in terms of how we are budgeting versus how we are recording revenues and how we are incurring expenses from a timing perspective? Are we recording them in the same accounting method? Are we on the accrual basis of accounting within our budget, but within the actual financial data, we're on a cash basis, right? If you have those disconnects, a lot of the value that you're going to find in the budgeting process and in the budget as a tool is really immediately out the window. You lose a lot of it when you have to start questioning whether those assumptions are actually fairly entered, and whether you're going to be reviewing data at an apples to apples level. So, I would first make sure accounting methodology is the same. I'm not going to recommend anybody use a cash basis, but at the same time, if you know that you do, great, budget that way as well, right? We want at the end of the day these two tools to be speaking the same financial language. Um, some other points on here that I mentioned, I called this out earlier. I would challenge each of you to try to budget by month. I think we've got some groups that are probably just budgeting for the whole year overall, and then maybe just spreading that number throughout the 12 months, which is fine in some cases. But I would challenge all of us to go a step further than that and really try to accurately put in those budget figures within the periods that we expect to either, again, incur the expenses or recognize the revenue. Um, so, that at the end of the day, that's really going to help this become a really powerful point of comparison, as we have those financial data pieces that continue to come through throughout the year. Okay, let's move into the collaboration element. So at this point, you've gone through a forecast. Potentially, you have put some initial assumptions together. You've used that forecast to build your initial budget. You have reviewed to make sure that, hey, everything is somewhat apples to apples. We are recognizing revenues the same way as we're reporting them on the budget, and vice versa. We've got it spread out by month. Great. So you've got a good starting point. The next thing, and this is critical, and this is maybe the most important piece of this whole presentation. Try to collaborate as much as possible on the budget. The budget should not be built in isolation. It really is owned by the whole organization. It's not just the person that's filling it out. As I'm shouting that as the CFO here, that I want to make sure if something goes wrong, it's not just me that owns this mistake. Mostly kidding. But at the same time, our program owners understand the real assumptions sometimes better than the person compiling the budget. In our case here, it's critical for me to loop in the head of our events team, our salespeople, the board leaders, to understand the strategic priorities and the strategic initiatives that they want to see us actually achieve. Our education folks, our heads of membership, our chapters team. I've got to work with all of those different stakeholders to make sure not only that I'm getting the assumptions somewhat right, but that there is a shared buy-in, right? This budget becomes the mile marker and the point of success for the organization. I want everybody within the group to be working towards the same goal. We should all know where those goals are and where those targets sit. And I think that helps build accountability within the team to kind of own that success line, and it really drives everybody towards the same goal. Rather than build it in isolation, you present numbers that maybe don't align with reality of certain programs, and that instantly drives disconnect and frustration within the organization. And I can tell you that from personal experience here starting this past year, where we already had a budget. I came in, and some of the first conversations I had with folks here, I found out very quickly that the budget was not a very collaborative process. And it wasn't a bad budget necessarily. But it just wasn't as collaborative. It didn't drive that community element that I think we really needed within the organization. And in certain cases, it really was a point of frustration. So, that's the potential downside of not collaborating with the right stakeholders. I think you really miss out on a great opportunity to bring your team together by really looping them into the budget process and giving that element of kind of shared ownership. All right. Next up, documenting our assumptions. This is I would say the one that gets missed the most of all of these budget items. You've now collaborated with your team, you've brought them all in, you've had these phenomenal conversations, probably several meetings, IMs, emails talking about goals and assumptions, all this, and you don't document them formally anywhere, right? They live in your email. It makes sense right now. It makes sense when you're doing it, but 6 months from now, a year from now, when you're trying to use the budget, if you don't have the assumption behind the number, a lot of times that number doesn't mean anything anymore, and it really loses the impact that you end up losing a lot of the work that you put in to the budget when you don't have those assumptions really well documented. So we don't want to lose the value. We don't want to just quickly abandon that. We want to make sure we are actually documenting all of our assumptions. That means how many registrants do we think we're going to get per event? What price point are we going to issue those registration tickets at? Are we going to have discount levels? Um, what is the membership rate going to look like? How many members are we going to drive? What's the thought process behind how we're going to make sure our retention numbers stay where they need to be? Um, you know, Document all of that, even if this file stays for you, right? Even if it's just hey, you're the CED. You're the one that's actually trying to make sure the budget is done on time and is presented accurately. At the end of the day, you need to have those assumptions ready for you to reference when questions come up. And it's really going to help you, you know, um, it's really going to help you understand and remember, well, wait a second, why did we land here? What were we doing? It's going to help you explain it at the end of the day. It's also going to help you in future budgeting cycles. When you come back and look at an old budget number, again, a number on a page without the assumption is very difficult to really garner any real information from. So, documenting the assumption will really preserve the value of the work that you're doing now. All right, let's jump into some mistakes to avoid next. We've talked about a couple of these throughout, but we'll layer these in here. Um, so the first one, and I appreciate that a lot of you are on this call today because the first one, hopefully you're going to avoid now, which is starting too late. I think you're all in exactly in the window that you should be to really start diving into the budget process. To me, I usually want 6 months of actual data because I want to build that forecast. I want the forecast to start me off. 6 months is where I try to draw the line to say, hey, I want that actual data set where I know I can rely on this piece, then I can layer it in from there. If you start too much earlier than this, there's a lot of the current year left to play out and things can change and you end up going back and doing several versions of the budget, which is fine too. I would prefer that rather than starting, mid-October or towards the end of September, where, hey, we've got 6 weeks to get a budget actually drafted and in front of our board so that we can get it approved prior to the fiscal year starting up. So try not to start too late. Again, I think you're all right in the right window now where you should be thinking about, hey, let's move this thing forward. We talked about assuming best case revenues. This goes for expenses as well. Again, I don't want to intentionally give us an easy target or some easy hurdle to hit. I want to give us a realistic estimate, right? Give us a realistic assumption that we can meet. That is really focused on historical data points, and that hopefully is on the trend line for how we've seen our programs move. We should be able to explain those assumptions, and we really should try to avoid best case revenues. That is a critical pitfall of the budget process. Talked about involving the right program owners. We want to make sure we've got everybody at the table and we're really promoting that buy-in of, hey, this is going to be the measure of success of the organization. Let's make sure we all agree on these assumptions and where we land. ignoring the one-time or unusual items. This one's tricky. This one's tricky because it's hard to know when exactly something is a one-time item versus when is it was now the new start of something new. Um, that requires a lot of thought. And again, that's where documenting your assumptions and why you did or didn't do what you wanted to within the budget is going to become really critical. I found that if you can explain what you did later on and it makes logical sense, it's going to make sense at that point too, even if it was wrong, even if it was the wrong assumption and something else happened, you at least know why you made the decision that you did. And now you can go back to kind of updating your thought process there and trying to fix that. So, um, you know, try not to ignore them, but I will recognize it is often hard to identify what is one time versus what is going to be the new normal. Um, I think I've kind of hit on some of these other ones already. Budgeting from last year's budget instead of current year forecasting. It's really easy to create a new forecast. I would go that extra mile and spend a couple hours putting together a forecast that you feel good about rather than just using the budget. Um, if we use the budget year over year over year, it ends up losing the value because it's really not based in reality anymore. Um, and then finally, the last one on here is treating the approved budget as final and never revisiting it again after that. I think that's a huge mistake. To me, this process is you're going to get out of it what you put into it. You all are here on this call today to think about the budgeting process, to talk about it. To me, that signifies that you're taking the first step in trying to do better, right? You're trying to improve your process. I love that. That's a great mindset to have. And there's a lot of great things that hopefully you can take from this conversation today and some of the other resources that we can share. And don't abandon it, right? You're going to get that budget approved at some point. You've put a ton of great work into it. Continue to utilize that budget as your point of comparison and refine some of those assumptions throughout the year because it's going to not only help next year's budget process, but it's going to make the decision-making element so much better mid-year, right? You're going to feel really confident about, well, hey, my budget shows that we are going to get here, but we're only 3 months into the year, and here's how we're performing. But my budget shows me that, well, that's fine, and I recognize that a lot of our revenues come in the second half. Um, Again, just an example, but try not to throw away all this value once it gets approved. I see that a lot too, that budgets just get ignored after they get approved. Um, okay, so I'm going to go through quick action items and then I'm going to pause for some questions. I've got one or two slides after this one, but so action items, just to kind of recap what we talked about. So step one, and these are action items for those of you that are looking to really start this process. I would gather your data, get your approved budget from last year, get your prior year financial data, and get your current year financial reporting. Use those elements, create a forecast for the rest of 2026. To me, this becomes your starting point for your 2027 budget. From there, you want to go through and build new assumptions. We want to build revenues conservatively and really aggressively look at our expense assumptions. At that point, I wouldn't focus on the bottom line quite yet, but build your assumptions and feel good about those assumptions that you come up with. Next, take those assumptions, collaborate, right? Bring in your program owners, bring in your board, bring in your other stakeholders, and make sure that what you've done makes sense. That there's not further refinement and further help that those folks can provide, and really promote that collaboration. That's absolutely critical. Five is the last thing is document. Make sure you document those assumptions and put those somewhere for your reference so that you can come back to those things later on. So, that's not going to completely build your budget for you, but I think those 5 elements will really start you off in a strong place. So, I've got 1 or 2 other slides, but I did want to take a quick pause and ask some questions here. I know we don't have a ton of time now.
Feel free if you have a question to either drop it in the chat or just come off mute.
While that's going on, I'm going to move to our next slide here, which actually put a pricing guide together. These are some of the benchmarks and assumptions that I used, or that I should say that we used in putting together the CAI HQ budget this year. Some of these benchmarks will be helpful for you. Others not as helpful. Some of these are very market dependent. Our membership revenue and rebates, of course, this is going to change drastically depending on chapter and where you're at in your membership. For us, we're looking at about 3.5% growth. Um, we saw the biggest piece of inflation hit us really within the event space. We used 10% as kind of our initial inflation marker. But we actually saw certain events hit closer to 19-20% in food and beverage costs and AV costs, especially. So, we again tried to be more aggressive with our expense projections for some of those events. Uh, I think there may be, is there a question in the chat? Let's see. What's up?
There
Did-
is.
Great. Do you
Do you
have
have any
tips?
tips or best practices when budgeting for new programs and events when you don't have a history to reference?
That's a great question. Recently started asking committees. You should actually transfer as well. So that's a great question. The first place I would go actually is to Kelly. I would go to my chapter's team. I would go to the other CED groups and ask that group who has done something, right? Who has been in this position recently? What did you see? What did your actuals turn out to be? Um, it's really difficult to find a perfect apples to apples comparison when you're talking about a new event or a brand new program. So in a lot of ways, you're going to just do your best. I would say try to be conservative. A lot of times I try to position new programs in that first year as like it's almost like a pilot. We are expecting to take a loss in some way, but we know that we're going to have a lot of great learnings from it. So from a budget perspective, I want to be very conservative on the revenue side. And again, be cautious on the expense side, do your best and really document those assumptions. I'd proactively be working out and reaching out to vendors and to venues if it was an event to try to understand what costs might look like if we're moving to a new region or a new market. But really, really rely on this CD group and your CAI chapters team because I think they'll be able to connect you with resources that will be able to give you some really good guidance there. That's a great question.
Do
Okay.
we get copies of the slides after by any chance?
Yes, we will send that with the recording. So that will go out in the weekly email that goes out to all of you. If you're a president, president-elect, or the CED. If you're not one of those, again, please feel free to share that recording and the presentation out.
Awesome. So, if there's no other questions, I'll just leave you with my final note here, which is really that our goal is again not to build a perfect budget. I don't think a perfect budget exists. So don't get hung up on trying to predict the future. That's not at the end of the day what you're trying to do. The goal is a really thoughtful, documented, and usable budget that helps not just you, but the chapter leaders and your board make better decisions throughout the year. So, take that mindset with you. Oh, and I don't think you can even see where we landed. There we go. I hope that you'll find some value in this. And if you have more questions, if you have those technical accounting questions, I'm happy to talk accounting all day long. So please do reach out. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you, John, for coming and hosting this. As you're working through this process, again, if you have any questions, please let us know. As John referenced, he's available. We have our finance team available, our chapter relations team. So we're here to help you with any of those questions throughout the process. Again, presidents and president-elects, you guys have an exchange group as well. So if you have things that you want to talk through with your peers, please post that in the exchange. And again, CEDs, you have your exchange group as well, so that people aren't having to recreate the wheel. Or like John said, if you're starting a new program, others can help provide some of that guidance as well with you. We also do have our chapter benchmarking survey. So depending on the program, we might be able to narrow down what chapters specifically we can help with that with. So with that, we will be providing the recording. the slides. And then also for our presidents, president-elects, and CEDs, you will be receiving an email shortly about what next year will be looking like from our side in terms of membership rebates, the different things that we're offering, such as we provide Zoom to all of the chapters. So just highlighting those pieces that will help factor into your budget process. So we'll be sending that out to you with all of this material as well. But thank you all for joining today. If you do think of anything else, please let us know. But otherwise, we hope you have a great and wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.